And something when we first connected, you described, and I love this phrase, you described this work as squishy. You're like, I do this squishy work. And I love that phrase because A, it just feels really nice. But two, you've also created a whole career consulting company following book on something that is, as you term, squishy.
Mhm.
So how do you how do you get people to say, I'm in on this squishiness?
Well, so I think to put some context into it, to give a little bit of background of who I am and where I came from, I worked in seniors care as an executive. I was a VP of HR, VP of operations, as well as a purchasing division of this large Canadian organization for 11 years. And I really worked and breathed the life of corporate.
Yeah.
And while I was in my corporate role, I experienced being a family member within the seniors care environment. But first with my dad, who was moved into long-term care, where he lived for 6 months and he passed away in 2011. With my mom and moving her with my two brothers' help into retirement living and then transitioning to assisted living, and she passed away in 2019.
Mm.
And I would say those were certainly significant and heart-wrenching, but the big shift for me was when my husband, Ty, got diagnosed with a limiting, pretty catastrophic rare disease. And I had to make that tough decision to move my husband of 25-ish years at the age of 63 into long-term care. And I was still working in the business as an executive, and I understood how long-term care and seniors care worked, but it just completely upended our lives. Obviously, our kids were 11 and 17 when their dad got sick. And so I was a family member for 4 years that Ty lived in long-term care, and he passed away at the age of 67 after 4 years in 2015. And then I continued to work in my corporate job, but I had this pull of knowing that I needed to do something more with the life experience and was being called on by colleagues and other relationships in seniors care to come and talk to their teams about what it was like being a customer, right? And you kind of look at it through that lens of customer service, but it became so much more of a calling and this conviction that we can do better with how our care team members and our families, that was really my lens I was looking through, can build relationships because it's a huge friction point for seniors care organizations. Residents are moving in. There's a family component. I mean, we won't even go down the road of everything that happened through COVID and the
Yeah.
breaching of the trust that was felt and this relationship that could use so much work. And
Yeah.
so, my first book was about how to help staff to, I use the acronym of recipe to really build the relationship and pulling a lot of my my positive psychology training in. And and I think my work has really evolved to helping and supporting families because I've got that personal experience and I'm one of them. And sometimes I can get away with saying things to families that other people can't because I'm one of them.
Right.
Sometimes we need the smarten up talk. But also it was how do I really support the care team members? For all the time I worked in corporate in my HR role in operations, I didn't have a clue as to the impact of difficult family relationships on frontline care team members. So I decided to leave my corporate job in my mid 50s, having worked corporate all my work life, and start my own company in 2018. And I'm in my 8th year. And because I just figured, you know what, I'm going all in, putting all the chips in, and what's the worst that can happen? And if I have a message that resonates and I can work closely with the people on the front line that need it the most and the leadership in the homes, and it's just been so incredibly gratifying. And so, coming from corporate with the KPIs and the ROI and
Yeah.
all of those measurables, and my clients still look for those, and we can certainly pull from the data with what they're gathering. But I also say it is squishy because it's hard to measure when you have had effective training and a mindset and a heart set shift with staff that they now start working with families differently and they view them in a more compassionate manner, or they can understand the narratives. How do we measure that escalation that didn't happen? How do we
Yeah.
measure that escalation to the governing body and the funder that then turns into a whole investigation because it never happened?
Yeah.
So, and I think that sometimes in being able to talk about that this does help the wellness and well-being and also can impact the retention and the attraction of your team members. But we're still talking about how we make other people feel in that
Yeah.
relationship dynamic that sometimes is hard to measure.
Yeah. And you've and I think we talked about this before, but the term of two-eyed seeing, we use that with indigenous ways of knowing and being. That you can see things through one lens and also see things through the Western colonial lens and or the Western construct. And so you've actually, in some ways, developed this way of two-eyed seeing. You see both, you see the full system. You see the relationship with the patients, with the families, with the caregivers, with the government, with the boards. You've looked at the totality of the system and said there's these interplays everywhere that impact these KPIs you want to achieve.
Yeah.
How have you worked with clients to again unsquish it, make it tangible, make it real? You talked about the idea of opening up, having a heart opened up. How do you go about doing that?
Well, I think initially, when I first started, I was doing a lot of training based on my first book, Recipe for Empathy, and it was 6 strategies to transform your families into fans. So there were certain leaders that I already had a relationship with, so they had a bit of a sense as to who I was, who I am, what my experience was. There's this real, I'm going to describe it as a fascination. I mean, to me, it was the life we lived, and it was 7 years of white knuckling for sure.
Mm,
Uh, but this fascination with how did it all work? That when people, I can still remember the day a colleague of mine, it was 2 or 3 months after Ty passed away. We were having dinner. It was probably my first conference traveling that I'd been away. And she said at the end of the dinner, "So, what was it like the day that you moved Ty into care?" And
mm,
you know what, Margie? Nobody had ever asked me that question. So it almost took me a bit aback, but as I started unpacking what the day looked like and the team were late and it was very transactional and how I felt like we had just been processed like widgets on a production line and squeezed into an already busy day. I looked at her and I could see she was starting to tear up and she said, "I feel so ashamed because we do that to our families every single day." And so there's an entry point of, yes, we're corporate and we're running the business, but to look through the lens of this is certainly client relationship and customer satisfaction. But I think that there's also this awareness, and I'm sure everyone on the call can agree, when you are sitting and witnessing somebody sharing a story, you become very present in that story and invested in that story. And the best way to be able to help people really build that context is through the story. And
mm,
as hard as it is for me to constantly be sharing that admission day story because I put myself back to that day, that will now be almost 14 years ago. What it does is it helps to bring to life, yeah, like what um, my colleague said. I feel really ashamed because we do that every single day and we need to do it differently.
yeah. Yeah. It's interesting you highlight that um, the presence and thinking about that admission day as that you are witnessing a moment of a significant shift in somebody's life.
Yeah,
And what an honor that is.
100%.
And how do you help, besides your story, what are some other approaches you've seen successful organizations use with their frontline staff to be able to be present in that moment, to create their own stories of working with people in that beautiful moment of transition?
I think the first step is we have to be able to create or highlight, develop a level of awareness. Why is this important? So we look at from a business perspective, and I'll
Right.
speak to Ontario because that's where I spent my work career. There was never a mandate by government to have an auditing process on your admission move-in process, right? There's a lot of things that are mandated and legislated and
Yeah.
regulated. So what happens is that it doesn't really become a point of focus. And so when homes say we've been admitting our residents the same way for the last 4 decades, and there hasn't been a need, I kind of come in and I poke the bear. I provoke. Apparently I was good at that as a kid too. But to be able to say, like, look, what's going on here? And these are all of the issues that can happen. And that when you don't take that time up front, you front end load the relationship and onboard your families right from the start. Using, pulling from HR, you have onboarding strategies for your employees, for your suppliers, all of that. Then you're going to pay the price down the road. And you're also contributing to the problem of what you are referring to as difficult families. I
Right.
say it's not a difficult family, it's a difficult family relationship. So I think if there isn't an appetite or a level of awareness that things can be better,
Hmm.
then it doesn't really tend to go very far. But once they're able to recognize that, and even with staff, when I'm doing training, and before I do my start with my workshop, I usually go and chat with staff and that are sitting there, how's it going? And what are your family relationships like? And a lot of them will say, well, they're good, they're okay. And then at the end of the 3 hours, they come up and go, oh my goodness, I had no idea how much we were tolerating, or these narratives that we make up about families and we're contributing to the problem. So
Mm.
part of my job is elevating the awareness that, or trying to challenge the limiting belief that some homes have that
Hmm.
difficult families are just another cost of doing business in seniors care. There's nothing you can do about it. They're just
Right.
difficult, demanding people. So, right, well, then we might as well just pack up our bat and ball and go home if that's the case. So a lot of it is challenging those narratives and
Hmm.
creating an invitation for how can you empower your team to be able to step into their experience and expertise so that they have the confidence and the ability to work with your families when, not if, when challenges arise. Because glasses will get broken, laundry will go missing, a
Hmm.
resident will be exit seeking, all of these things that will happen. Let's prepare ourselves and be proactive versus what we can tend to
Right.
be in healthcare, which is reactive, wait for the problem, then come up with a solution. I'm like, let's avoid the problem altogether. Let's just completely circumvent it by putting these things in place. So I don't know, did I answer your question? I kind of went off on a roll.
Yeah. No, you're challenging, you're actually trying to recreate and create a context and an environment that builds trust at the outset,
Yeah.
because that trust will pay off in dividends down the road.
And knowing that, here's the thing, I really believe that at the beginning of that relationship, we are in a relational deficit. The
Yeah.
family's coming in, they're questioning if they're making the right decision. They can't believe that it's come to this. And I'm,
Hmm.
I'm speaking like a lot of times in long-term care, but even retirement assisted living, right?
Yeah.
It's a bit of a forced decision. It's all uncertain. Their life is being turned upside down. There is loss. And then on the other side, you've got the staff who some homes are having move-ins multiple times a week, and they've already got a busy day. They don't know what the resident's going to be like. Right.
Hmm.
All they have is the paperwork, and a lot of times it's not even accurate or up to date. They have no idea what the family's going to be like. And if you've been burned once by a difficult family relationship, you're always expecting the worst. And sometimes they're not even sure that the admission process itself, all the departments are working fluidly together, because maybe there's a breakdown in communication. So, I mean, here we want to be building trust, but you've got two parties meeting, all carrying their own admission anxiety with them, and we're starting in a deficit. And
Yeah.
family doesn't know what they don't know. So part of my work with teams is to create the awareness that this admission anxiety exists. And let's just call it out, team. We've all felt this, and it's okay to talk about it. And what can we be doing to be intentional with a well-designed approach in how we're meeting that family in that very first interaction and start putting deposits into the relational bank account? Because if, in my experience, they were running late, it was very transactional, I felt like we were just being squeezed into that already busy day.
Yeah.
My narrative in my head is, if they can't even make time for us right now, how are they going to provide the time needed to take care of my husband?
Right.
It was all subconscious at the time, but
Yeah.
I really started to unpack it. And so this is where I go back to, there's so much that the care team members and leadership can be doing intentionally and proactively to invest in having that versus leaving it up to chance, which happens a lot of the time. And it has to go back to the philosophical buy-in that when a resident and family are moving in, that is one of the most important experiences and relationship to build on that day. And
Yeah.
that's a huge mindset shift.
Yeah. Well, you're highlighting in many ways, and I always go back to this theory because it makes so much sense 'cause it's about people, but it's self-determination theory. And it's that we have three psychological nutrients that have to be fed. And it's a sense of autonomy and being self-directed, and that I'm in charge of me.
Yeah.
It's a sense of competence that I know how to do something well and have an impact. And I need a sense of relationship and being connected to a community and a sense of inclusion.
Mm.
And environments can either foster that or detract from that. And the very nature of this shift, if you think about from a resident perspective, all those three things are threatened. They're leaving their life, they're leaving their autonomy. They don't know if they're making the right decision. And so, how do you create ways to bolster those three nutrients in that
Mhm.
transitional sense?
Well, and that's where I think that education and being aware that this is a condition that is ripe for breaking down trust, breaking down confidence, right? And that by taking that approach and knowing, and sometimes it's the story we're making up in our head. We have no idea how the family feels, but if we go into it considering that they may be feeling anxious, afraid, uncertain, guilty, grief stricken, all of those things, then how am I as a person going to show up and meet that person where they are? Because people who work in healthcare, they typically don't do it for the money. They're doing it because they want to care for people and not just in that clinical sense, right? They want to be able to provide some of that emotional comfort. And sometimes where care team members are dealing with their own levels of burnout and stress and overwhelm,
Yeah.
the long range benefit of bringing a relational approach is that we're going to be able to start helping staff to preserve some of their bandwidth, their energy, their ability to focus, because if we can lessen the amount of time that they're feeling anxious and worried and afraid about, they know that family member is going to come in and is going to hover over their shoulder and ask them a million questions and going to threaten to go to the administrator, and they're all stressed out, and then it becomes the perfect storm.
Hmm.
If they don't have to deal with all of that, then their presence is going to be a lot more grounded to be able to do the work that they're doing.
Yeah. 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 And so you're really talking about a mix of environment and self. How do you start with self? How do you create an environment that gives you the space to start with self
Mhm.
and allow yourself to be present for that person in that moment?
Yeah.
Hmm. That's pretty cool.
Well, and I think that, we talk about the relational approach. It is, what do I know about me when I'm in a stressful situation? How do I typically react?
Yeah.
And being able to care team members know this is no shame, no blame. We're not being judgmental here. But when you've got someone who is you perceive as barking at you and demeaning you, how do you typically react? And it goes back to that whole react versus respond.
Yeah.
But, when our amygdala is going off and we're having a hard time composing ourselves, that that's when some of those reactions can come out that end up, adding to the toxicity of the relationship.
Yeah.
It takes practice to be able to take a beat, pause, and whether that self-talk is, I know this isn't about me, but even creating the awareness with care team members that a lot of times when a family is expressing themselves with anger, what's really hidden underneath that is the fear. And that we can really pull into our compassion if we choose to tell ourselves that story, that that's what's really occurring here.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. The brain isn't always the smartest thing. It tends to just go with
No.
like the first thing that pops in your head and you're like, oh, that's real.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like the one staff member that got so triggered by a family, she said, "Don't let the door hit your butt on the way out."
Oh,
That's not going to work well.
no, 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 no. There's a colleague of mine and Amy's who's also on this call, and she always says, well, don't get furious, get curious.
Yeah, love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why don't we hold it there? I'd love to hear from everyone else on this call. It's really quite incredible the work you do, and the clarity with which you describe the importance of this is outstanding. So I'm really happy we have this on record.
Oh, thank
Um,
you.
that being said,